Thank you for joining us at home. We are dedicating the next few episodes to conversations on race.
Our goal for this podcast from the very beginning was to simply have meaningful conversations about the foundations of home life, because we really believe that the values we learn at home are those that we often live by and carry with us into the world.
So we would like to share with you our journey in learning more about the systemic racism that has brought us to this day. Sadly, we as a whole have let atrocities against all minorities, particularly Black people, compound for far too long. And in our ignorance, the lives of many innocent people have been tragically lost to violence.
We hope that by sharing our learning process, we can encourage you to look deeper as well, to reflect on our own biases, to be curious and challenge our own ideologies, and to listen and to open our minds and hearts to just have these difficult conversations. And we're confident that this is the path to positive change and that it can all start with each one of us right at home.
We'd like to thank each of our experts in this series. We look to them for insight on how we can better communicate and for the tools each of us can practice to eradicate racism and create a just society for all. We're truly thankful for their selflessness to share their knowledge with us.
In this episode, we speak with Dr. Howard Stevenson on racial literacy. Dr. Stevenson is a nationally recognized clinical psychologist and researcher on negotiating racial conflicts using racial literacy for schools, mental health centers, teachers, parents, and police.
You can also check out his TED Talk, How to Resolve Racially Stressful Situations. And if you'd like to learn more, we will be sharing resources on our website, athomepodcast.net, and on our social media. And listen to our other guests in the series, Jane Elliott on One Human Race.
And Kenny Leon on the power of story.
This is Dr. Howard Stevenson. How have you been over the past week? I'm sure you're getting a lot of calls and you've been very busy.
Yes, I have. And I've been a roller coaster of emotions as so many other people. I feel like it's, I'm just a few seconds off from crying, from yelling and angrily. And then there's some healing in all of that as well, and trying to take care of loved ones at the same time. I still feel hope. So it's really as many different feelings going on at the same time.
Well, we do have to say thank you, because within all that frustration and pain, where we find hope is speaking and listening to people like you. Yeah, experts who know how to communicate when it surrounds racial socialization. One thing I wanted to start off with, though, is can you define for us? I think a lot of people have used the word racial literacy, but don't quite understand exactly what that means.
There's several definitions. Lonnie Guinier, as a famous lawyer, had written about this regarding sort of a legal frame. And I've been using it primarily to think about it with respect to behavior and emotions. And so my research is on racial socialization. Does it matter when parents talk to their children about racial politics? Does it help them academically, emotionally? How do they think about themselves and others? There's a lot of positive work from that, but it's often about asking parents, how often do you talk about this? And asking young people, how often have you received this kind of information around race? Racial literacy, the way we've described it, has extended that racial socialization sort of research and world from not just asking how much have you done this or how much have you heard this, but what we know more about how skillful are you in applying this when you talk to people? How skillful are you in applying these strategies when someone attacks you, either micro aggressively or macro aggressively? Do you have the tools to emotionally manage the stress of a racial moment so that it doesn't stay with you, so it doesn't affect your behaviors or your health? We know more now about how racism affects health outcomes in children, from cardiovascular issues to sleep. So, what tools? Racial literacy is about the ability to read, recast, and resolve a racially stressful moment, which can be quite debilitating if you accumulate a lot of racially stressful moments and you walk away from them feeling like I'm confused. I'm not sure how to handle this. Or what a lot of young people do is they internalize there's something wrong with me. These racial literacy skills are about how to protect yourself both emotionally and physically.
I feel one of the things that I've heard quite a bit is the fact that it's scary to confront some of these issues with your family. having parents talk to their children and they don't know how to talk to their children, or like you said, they don't know how to equip them with the right tools to be prepared in how to communicate, especially in a stressful situation or when they are confronted with some sort of racial prejudice. What would you say are the tools that you think that parents, whether it's white parents talking to their children or whether it's black parents talking to their children or any parents of diversity, how do you think they should prep themselves?
I think, one of the things we've learned is that talking about race is incredibly stressful. And for some people, it's almost so stressful, they get tongue-tied, they get paralyzed, or they run away from the topic, or they literally, some get so overwhelmed it becomes, fighting kind of moment. So the first thing is, how do you manage the stress of the conversation? How do you notice what effect that stress has on you? So we've come up with some racial mindfulness approaches to help people. First, before you go solving a problem, maybe before you decide to have that conversation, what do you notice about yourself when racial issues come up, right? What happens, like if you were to calculate, we call it calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. Calculate is first about what feelings do you notice that you're having. So we've asked people, if you got to watch the video of George Floyd or other incidents, what's the first thing that you notice about yourself? And some people will be very angry, some will be very sad, some may be a combination. And then we asked them to calculate on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense was that feeling? My sadness was at an 8, my anger was at a 6. And that's very important to help you manage your thoughts in those moments. Then locate, like where in your body do you feel that anger? Where do you feel that sadness? Because since our body keeps the score of our feelings, one of the challenging issues we've noticed in talking about race, people get really stressed not only by the conversation, but what their body is doing during the conversation that they can't control, they can't make sense of, which heightens their fear and interrupts what they want to say, what they want to believe, what they want to think, and how to communicate, how to even have access to memory. So locating allows you to say, wow, it's happening in my right leg is shaking, or it's in my throat, which keeps me from talking. I can use relaxation strategies to help calm myself in that particular area and then regain thought or access to memory, and then speak. So you got calculate, locate. Communicate is, do I notice what I'm saying to myself? Self-talk. And do I also notice what images come to mind? Some people have described, when I saw what happened to George Floyd, it reminded me of my brother or my father or my son or my siblings. And in many respects, the images come up in your head. That also affects how you speak to someone, how you listen to someone. So images and self-talk. And then finally, breathing and exhaling allows you, if you're really stressed in the conversation, because when we're really stressed, our brain goes on lockdown. We lose peripheral vision and hearing. And we're only focused on what's in front of us, which means we're really not gathering a lot of information to the left or the right. And we see this often with people with high stress jobs, like police officers and teachers, who literally are making really bad decisions based on limited information. And so breathing, exhaling allows oxygen to come to your brain for you to get more access to memory and thoughts and voice. And we think make healthier decisions in the process. And I know that's a long-winded way of talking about it, but if a parent said to me, what should I do first? I'd say, do this first, calculate, locate, communicate, breathe and exhale, and take what you know about yourself before you have that conversation, and then explain it to your child. Daddy gets a little upset. I get a little angry. I'm a little scared because when I was growing up, this happened. I felt helpless, and I didn't know who to go to. So explaining my feelings about even how difficult it is to have the conversation can be very helpful to young people to appreciate whatever they're going through is absolutely okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's such a clear way of I guess, processing feelings and information. And I think the problem a lot of us have is that we jump right to communicating because we feel the obligation to just speak right away before even calculating and locating what that feeling is or where it is. And I think if we all just paused and thought about how we are relating to a situation that we, right away may think like, oh, that's happening to someone else. I think that's the issue. It's not just happening to someone else. It's happening to all of us. So your process there really empowers every individual to take action within themselves first.
Yes.
I was watching the documentary, the 13th, and I remember when I was watching it, there's one piece of footage that they have. It's from many, many years ago, but it's an image of an older black man walking down the street, and there's a horde of white men around him pushing him, and he's just trying to walk away with dignity, and he's not instigating, and they just keep pushing him, and they knock him down. He picks up his hat, he just puts it back on, and keeps walking. And the feeling I had in my gut was a feeling, I had a feeling of confusion, anger, but I had this sickening pain in my gut just watching that. And I think that's one of those situations that you're talking about. So me as a white male seeing them do this to this person who is not instigating any way, he is just another human being, it absolutely sickens me. What are the, do you feel that it's obviously very important for black parents to have these conversations with their children, but why is it equally important or very important for white parents to have these conversations with their children starting at a young age?
No, that's a great question in a sense, because if you don't have to deal with racism every day, and we know that not all white parents have to, some do, but if you don't, you may feel like this is not a big deal to even have a conversation about. And so you may be torn as to, if I talk about race on any level, will I sort of damage my child's childhood in a sense? Will they become burdened with something that they are too young to make sense of? And I think when white parents are able to talk to their children about these, they actually are preparing their children not just for what they might go through as children, but who their friends might go through and what their friends might go through. Who they care about and are sort of vicariously catching some of the stress that their friends might endure if their friends talk about it, or if they witness their friends going through some instances of harassment. So a parent who actually tells a story like you were describing might also throw in, how sickened I felt, but also I wanted to do something, right? And then you could have a conversation with your child about what would you want to do? What did you want to do? Even let's say you had all the power in the world, what would you have wanted to do? And that's one of the ways we think about in all conversations is to imagine possibilities of action, where you felt helpless, but in a sense it can be very helpful to young people to hear from a parent. Even though I felt helpless, what would I have wanted to do?
And what about for non-Black parents of color? Does the conversation, I know fundamentally the conversation is the same, we are all humans, but what are the nuances that non-Black parents of color can be mindful of?
I think, there has also been some books written about non-Black parents of color and articulate a kind of racial literacy. So if you're a white parent of a child of color, and the author whose name it's escaping me right now, she's an anthropologist, has written about how those parents had to catch up in learning in terms of what their children were going to go through that they themselves hadn't gone through. And if you think about, all parents want to protect their child. It's like a crash course in racial politics. And those parents have gone through a lot of issues from, what we all do, kind of ignoring it, keeping a colorblind sort of approach to these issues, hoping by not bringing them up, they will go away. But they're often quickly confronted with the reality that their children cannot ignore those things. And you can't create a world where you wouldn't be confronted by it. And many are forced to have to, learn on the fly. But the same would apply around CLCBE. How do you take care of you? How do you notice what's going on with you? I think the other amazing thing that we've learned from parents, non-Black and brown parents, is we think that most of our communication around race and politics comes verbally. But if you have a family that doesn't want to talk about race, it highlights the area of research that tells us that nonverbal communication may be way more powerful than verbal communication. So children, amazing creatures and brilliant that they are picking up from parents what they're not saying and what they're afraid to do as much as anything else. And they may interpret that nonverbal behavior as a reticence or a fear, or that race is scary. And in many respects, learn how, or sort of be trained how, to not talk about race, right? Mm-hmm. That they can be very skillful at not bringing up these things, at avoiding those things. And while those strategies reduce stress, they don't make children or young people or adults any more competent in how to navigate it.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind giving an example that might be overlooked as an example of a racially stressful situation that, might happen every day, but we may not notice as such?
Yes, it's a great question. There's several that come to mind. I'm trying to think. Sometimes when you walk into a store, in fact, this happened for one of our doctoral students many years ago, who was African American, walked into a store, and in the process of walking into that store, was first in line to see the manager. And when the manager came out, who was a white male, another patron, a white male, came in, and instead of serving the black male student, the manager went directly to the white man and served him first, and it became a big incident. But I've seen in a lot of public places, not sort of paying attention to who was next, or giving privilege as a function of someone who's been around longer or someone I know. Might seem benign to some people, but is an example of a racial microaggression, right? That at some level, you want managers of stores or people to be cognizant of these issues, and those who are not cognizant that was a racial moment that literally made the student feel incredibly diminished, and it led to some other sort of negative consequences. But, in some stores, they actually have numbers that you can take that could address some of that, where you stand in line. But some places there's no line, and you can see biased preferences come out of that then could lead to other issues. But individuals, very stressful to have to witness and watch, and they say, should I speak up? Should I have said that I'm next? Should I keep quiet? Should I just wait? Those are tensions that for some families they're not thinking about. And others are always thinking about.
I remember when I think it was late high school or just out of high school, I went to a store with a friend of mine who's black. And I had never thought of this before, but he had made a comment about every time I go to a store, their security or just happened to be in the area that I'm in. And I hadn't thought about that before because I hadn't experienced it. And when I went into the store with him, I remember seeing the moment we came in the door, you see the security people, their eyes go up, and then all of a sudden, whatever aisle he was in, they were over just out of his reach, just kind of keeping an eye on things. And it blew my mind. I had never realized that, but again, too, I just had not seen it. I hadn't been paying attention or looking for that. And so that was something that opened up my eyes to prejudice. It was something that I don't receive that he does. Can you define for us, what do you see as the difference between prejudice and racism?
So just using your example, which is a great example of, prejudice would be, let's say that, folks might believe that Black patrons who come into a store are more likely to steal, in a sense, or do something different than white patrons. And in some level, having that attitude or belief in and of itself could be prejudicial, or that you might think that white patrons are more likely to buy stuff in that store. And so you give them more attention. It could be prejudicial in a negative or positive direction. Either way, it's still prejudice. Racism is sort of the act of power. This is a way of using power to enact those prejudices. Just because we have those beliefs walking down in and out of, establishments in and of itself is just an attitude. But if you actually say to the security guard, because of those attitudes, I now want you to follow all the Black patrons, or to your customer service crew, I want you to, spend more time engaging white patrons because they're more likely to buy. That is racism in a sense, because your institution is using its power to block opportunity or provide extra opportunities based on these racial attitudes. So racism is about the power to change someone's experience or life using those prejudicial attitudes.
It frustrates me when you look back and you dig into the prison system, how it's a money-making business. And they're just trying to fill the prisons so that there's more money to be made. And they're looking for reasons to arrest people to put in jail. And they're focusing the light on the Black community. So what's a path to moving away from that? Yeah,
that's important. And quickly now, some people are discussing to divest, from any company that supports a prison industrial complex just for that reason, right? Because they're making money off of putting people in jail. You mentioned 13th earlier. My brother is Brian Stevenson, and he's the one who runs EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, and was supportive of in that film about the narrative issue and what the 13th Amendment doesn't address. But Brian's always talked about, the South may have lost the Civil War, but they won the narrative around race. And in a sense, that narrative includes a host of instructions about who is dangerous, who is threatening, who is more likely to commit crime. And you don't need science or information or data to support that narrative. And so people use that narrative as a way to define themselves. So if police officers are warriors instead of guardians to protect and serve, that narrative helps you then say, when I find the most dangerous, that's where I apply extreme prejudice or violence or military options. And I think that the way that we can address these issues generally is to challenge that narrative. How do you challenge the narrative that this person is just as human as the other person? And how do you get at these issues in ways that protect all citizens? And I think, the crazy the power is, let's say if you're walking in a store, like you were saying with your friend, challenging a police officer or challenging a security guard who follows my friend is often an act of a very powerful act because of that narrative of whose voice is more important to be listened to if a situation goes wrong. So, we know a lot about how this narrative even affects how we look at preschool children. So, another question might be, how early should we be talking to children? How early should we be thinking about these narratives? And my great friend from Yale, Walter Gilliam, has been studying that how we expel kids even in preschool based on race without any real evidence to support that children of color are misbehaving differently than white children.
And when it comes to parents talking to kids at developmental age about these issues, how do you do so in a manner that's not instilling fear? Because that is the last thing we want to do. We see all over media these, it is real life, but how do we share it in a way that makes them aware but isn't instilling fear or feeding into the fear?
Yeah, it's a good question as well. In the early 2000s, I and some colleagues wrote a book. We're primarily targeting Black and brown parents, but we were thinking about all parents in general and wrote this statement that parenting is a lifelong acquaintance with helplessness, right? So even if you think, you get it one year, the next year you might feel like, wow, I don't know what I'm doing. And this could happen for the entire time you're a parent. So we think that everybody struggles with parenting around this sense of managing and raising our children. But parents of color are navigating a world where they are stressed not only by parenting stress, competency, but also racial stress or worries about our children racially profiling. And we tell children scary things growing up all the time as parents, right? And parents will tell me, well, I don't want to talk about race because race. I said, I was with a group of fifth graders in Chicago, and I asked them, do your parents ever say anything scary to you? And they said, yep. And generally speaking, they said is they don't talk to strangers and don't take candy from strangers, right? And other parents will talk about, here's what we do if the house catches on fire. We'll go through these, or bad touch, good touch. Mm-hmm. And I said to them, do you ever you ever had a stranger show up to you, somebody you don't know, and offer you candy? He said, no, but we're real prepared for it, mm-hmm. right? And it's like they know what to do for those scenarios. But if you took it at face value, that's a pretty scary thing to say to a child, that somebody out of the blue might come, offer them candy, and take them away. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't keep children from sleeping. And it's not like that creates nightmares mm-hmm. in children because of that. And we say that because you love your children, you have all these other ways to help them navigate difficult topics, and love being supreme in that regard. Race is no different in that sense, particularly if you can clarify, answer questions, and protect them when they are fearful. Mm-hmm.
Now, you have two sons. How have you found, you're an expert, you're a clinical psychologist, mm-hmm. you're an educator with racial literacy and racial socialization. And in your house, though, do you find, even with all the knowledge that you have, that you still find certain struggles with communicating with your family?
Yes, absolutely. And I have, my oldest is 29 and my youngest now is 15. And it so happens that my oldest works with my brother in Alabama, the Equal Justice Initiative, as a filmmaker, which is great. So I feel great and less fearful because he's with somebody I know who's looking out for him in different ways. Even though he's 29, I still see him as my little baby, right? Mm-hmm. And my 15-year-old, Julian, is actually, as a teenager, is a very different spot. So it's easier to talk about for the world and harder to manage with your own children, because my fear kind of takes over whenever anything that's been happening the last week happens. I see them in these moments and I rehearse, if I was there, what would I do? And sometimes too much. And I did a TED Talk regarding my youngest son when he was 8. He overheard Trayvon Martin's parents crying on the television, just happened to be on right after the George Zimmerman trial when he was acquitted. And he wouldn't stop talking, Dad, what about this? And I wasn't ready for it. I literally, with all the experience I had, wasn't really ready. We were folding clothes. I just wanted to keep folding clothes. I didn't want to, turn the TV off. But his persistence in asking the questions forced me to try to engage with him in a way that was awkward, but mostly because I usually start those conversations. And I did it for both of them when they were 8. But this time he was starting the conversation, which changed the rhythm and the energy and trying to match where he was coming from, threw me off in a good way. But I would say it's definitely different, when you have to do it for yourself.
You mentioned your TED Talk. I know you've done a few. You did one called How to Resolve Racially Stressful Situations. Mm-hmm. And so is there a time when you were out in public or you were at some establishment with your family and you saw this racially stressful situation or prejudice towards your children? How did that make you feel? And did that, all the preparation that you had, did that sort of go out the window in the current emotion that you had?
There have been several, right? And it's funny how people feel like they have the right to come up to a child, if you're an adult, without knowing them, and then throw out things. My youngest son, we had just come from a soccer game, and there was a band playing in the distance for another game, the Star Spangled Banner. So as part of the opening of the game, and my son, at first, unbeknownst to me, decided to kneel. Right, we were walking away. So I looked for him, and he's back there kneeling. And while he was kneeling, a white woman came up to him and said, you shouldn't be doing that. You don't know how many people who died in order for. And I said, this is not about you. His father, he said, his grandfather fought in the war, and he gave him the right to do whatever he wants to do. Leave him alone, right? There's no reason for you to, So I was angry on so many levels that someone felt they had the right. And I probably didn't calculate communicate too well in that sense, except to say we have family members who have also sacrificed their lives on behalf of freedoms, including my son kneeling whenever he wants to. And in a sense, I think, the focus on racial literacy is how do you find your voice in those moments, right? And is that protection for your child? Is that a way to send a message? But it doesn't always go that easily, right? Because I remember myself hyperventilating. I'm like, first shocked that he would be approached, and what danger he might be in a very few set of seconds. But then, what I want him to walk away with, I want him to walk away remembering his grandfather, and that more than, whatever he got from her.
And I guess with that situation in mind, speaking to the other side of that, I guess what tools can we offer to people who might feel offended by a peaceful form of protesting, for them to calculate within themselves what they're seeing, because we're always talking about on the side of like defensiveness, but we shouldn't have to always be on the side of defending ourselves. So on the other side, what can that person think and walk through in their minds?
I think it depends on who the person is, right? I think in terms of white supremacists who take certain positions, I'm not sure that would go well in terms of how they might be thinking about it. And I think without a debate, without a conversation, it's hard to engage someone to try a new method. But my encouragement would still be, let's say you're confused and let's say you don't understand why somebody would kneel, or you notice that someone kneeling triggers memories of you about a loved one, maybe your own father or grandfather that had fought and for these reasons. CLCBE would be very useful to maybe help you. How would you engage a dialogue with somebody who thought differently about this peaceful protest, right? And how would you be more prepared to hear a side of this that was different than yours? And then how would you then, after hearing that, be empowered enough to share your side of the story without it being an indictment, right? And I think we need to have more like, longer conversations, not these 15-second commercial moments, but, 2-hour full-length feature conversations where you don't have to put away what you believe, but can you listen to others' views in the process? And that takes a lot of emotional energy. Mm-hmm. But I think you could use the mindfulness skills to help you stay in it. And that's the work we do, helping people to stay in, not run away, not turn it into a militaristic moment, and not freeze.
Well, I think in all lives interactions, I mean, race prejudice aside, one of the biggest issues in society is lack of communication with each other. How I say something is not received the way I'm intending half the time. It's somebody receives it in a different way based on their life and their experiences. And so in general, I think better communication, better understanding, and thinking for a moment before speaking could really help all of us. And then specifically when we're talking about hate and racial prejudice and everything that we're talking about right now, even more so. I mean, though that communication needs to be had. When we're looking at Black Lives Matter, and there are a lot of people posting on social media hashtag Black Lives Matter. I know there has been some back and forth about how that's being communicated, how the non-Black community are communicating in order to support, but some people see that as us clouding the message of the Black community. What's your thought on how we can support with amplifying the Black community's voices instead of clouding your initiatives and what you're trying to do?
Mm-hmm. I think it is important. I believe, one of the things Martin Luther King said that I found very powerful is that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I think part of that is his own experience with, wanting folks to speak out when it costs them something. And I think the idea that, even the Black Lives Matter notion being challenged is a sense that, if all lives matter, why do we have to focus on that? And, other folks can say, well, when's the last time you've seen someone white sort of being in a video ordered by a police officer in the ways that we've seen a host of people over the last 3 years, let's say, right? Do you think that is and there's a host of data that can be thrown and suggested to help people just slightly rethink, in a lens, that narrative that we were describing. I think that's very helpful. That this isn't just one moment in time, right? This is something that's been going on for centuries. And in a sense, hearing from white people towards other white people, my talking about it might not have the same impact as someone who looks like them, who talks like them, or hears and sees their narratives very differently. And I think we underestimate, who am I most likely to listen to if they're challenging me? And I think that's another place where folks can speak to who in my community doesn't get this in a way, right? What if my child were, at risk around these issues? And I think presenting that to folks in majority communities can make a big difference in how they even consider approaching the topic, or how I'm going to teach civil rights today is a big issue. If you look at 80% of our teachers in public schools are white.
Your organizations or causes that you support, I know PLAY, Preventing Long-Term Anger and Aggression in Youth, is an important initiative. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So we've been using racial literacy in our group therapy sort of framework for young people, but also using physical activity like basketball and sports as a way to help young people understand moments of stress. So we deliberately use sports as a way to help kids get into stressful moments and use the skills like CLCBE to navigate out of them. So that earlier work was focusing on kids who were struggling around issues of depression and anger. In general, we found it useful with anyone where the physical activity is another way to work out your emotions. We can learn a lot about how you cope and solve problems and struggle with problems by how you navigate these conflicts on the court. And we can transfer that learning not only from the court, but to the classroom, to the neighborhood street corners. We also have other programs where we teach families how to talk to their children about race, where we split the parents and the children up. So parents can start to work on their own traumas from childhood before they have the conversation and process and socially, emotionally engage that history. And children can talk about their experiences, and then they can come together. And we found that very useful. And these are parents of color who still struggle about how to start that conversation, how to hear their children, and how to actually share their own stories of childhood, which children love. Children love hearing their own parents' struggles with these cultural realities. And that program is started by Dr. Rihanna Anderson and myself, called Embrace, as a way to address some of the things we've been talking about today. Because it's not easy to talk about this, even for parents of color.
We all believe that any peace that happens in the world has to start at home. So that's why these conversations are so important. Beyond conversations within individual households, what are some ways that we can take this conversation outside of the house, for parents and for kids to apply? What's the next step in creating this change outside of our homes?
I think schools and I think teachers, and, we've been able to, show up in classrooms. In my son's school, actually, some teachers were open to letting us come into the classroom. And we've been in lots and lots of classrooms and schools around the country. But just a chance with young people in the high school, for example, took some of the skills and beyond what we had actually intended, decided to use CLCBE framework and to find their voice to having conversations with their peers And so one class literally kind of infected other classes and other students on sports teams, in the lunchroom, in the hallways, where they would literally use the mindfulness strategy to challenge microaggressions in the school space. And some of the students even went to their parents or to other teachers. So it was almost like, I hate to use the word, it infected folks, in a larger way than we thought. So schools are particularly important places, I would say, and educators. But students to find their own voices have very creative ways to go beyond what we had thought originally, and even outside of homes.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that now with protesters and activists. A lot of the youth population, they're the ones leading the way.
Absolutely.
And can we go one step further beyond, so from home to schools, what's after that?
Well, obviously politicians are important, in our government. The more we think about, I just heard that in Minneapolis, the school district decided to cut the police contract. And I think in a way, and I hope I'm right about that, but part of the idea behind it is to say, if the police in the schools see themselves as warriors, not guardians, as my brother has talked about, then this is hampering the education they're actually experiencing. We know that in schools that have really difficult discipline and disproportionate discipline towards Black and brown students, the culture and climate is less safe. All students report it as a less safe environment, and it affects achievement outcomes. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you could say, here's why we decided to not use police is also to say, we're trying to improve the climate of learning. And that's a systemic intervention. And then you could say, well, is the school teacher who's teaching social studies and history using that in their class, in their AP classes, to say, here are the kind of changes that we need to make, not only in an educational system, but in a justice system, right? What kind of changes like this can we make that make it much more possible for people to be children who are learning rather than children who could be patrolled and profiled from, first period class to second period class to third period class to gym around the entire campus. Now, that's not to say also that we couldn't change policing or change security guards or change how they treat and provide services in schools as another strategy that's more humane.
Is there anything else as a message for any of our listeners or any other direction to help us understand how we can communicate in a stronger way about racial literacy? Anything else for setting us off on the right path?
Well, I think noticing yourself is probably it. There's a proverb we use. It's an African proverb, and the group that I work with is a nonprofit called The Lion Story, because of this proverb, which goes, the lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. And at the base of that proverb, which can mean a lot of different things to people, is that everybody's story is important, but you're responsible for telling that story. You can't expect someone else to tell it. And a lot of our children and families of color are living under somebody else's story, somebody else's narrative about them. But the incredible sense of empowerment that we can have if we tell our own narrative. So I say white and Black and brown parents and families, what's your story? Where do you come from in this moment? And what do you notice about yourself while you're trying to engage that story? When I look back, what do I notice about what happens to my body, to my thoughts, the images in my head? And can I use that? Because that belongs to me, right? I may not know how you plan to go about this, but at least I have my own narrative as to the challenge of dealing with race and politics in this society.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. We're also going to share a link to The Lion Story, which we really appreciate everything that you do and your team do to help broaden our way of thinking and communicating, to help resolve issues surrounding racial literacy. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This is wonderful what you're doing as well. Thank you.